You're ready to go.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Lydia Chavez. I'm the executive editor of Mission Local. We're based in the Mission, but we cover San Francisco from the Mission. And I'm here today with the League of Voters of San Francisco to do this interview with Zac Dillion, who has been immersed from the Public Defender's Office in issues of police reform. But first, a bit about the League of Women Voters of San Francisco is a nonpartisan political nonprofit that defends democracy. They provide education, encouraging people to vote in elections and participate in government. They also engage in advocacy to influence public policy that benefits the community. And today's discussion is exactly that, with Zac Dillion, who has been, as I said, immersed in these issues at the Public Defender's Office. Before being there, he's joined 7 years ago. He was a graduate fellow at the Northern California Innocence Project, and before that, a pro bono coordinator for the Community Legal Services in East Palo Alto. So we're here to talk about legislation that has numbers in front of it, SB 1421, AB 748, and SB16, all of which have to do with transparency in the police department. And Zac, why don't you just lay out broadly what these do? And also, I think, what is the connection between this legislation and the Public Defender's Office?
Sure, thank you. So picking them in order of passage, AB 748 was Assembly Bill 748. It was passed in 2018, went into effect in 2019. And that outlined how police body camera footage would be made available to the public. Prior to that, there was no overarching governing or regulation around it. Then right after that, SB 1421 passed, and that went into effect January of 2019. And that changed the way public records are classified. Prior to that, the ACLU had called the state of California the most secretive police state in the country. Police personnel records were incredibly hard to obtain for anyone, including for criminal defense attorneys. For example, if someone is representing client A and wants to find information on a police officer to try and impugn their credibility while testifying, they have to do what's called a pitcher's motion, which takes between 14 and 90 days or so to file and have everything go through, and then gets information. If the next day that same attorney gets client B and has the same arresting officer, the attorney can't share that information with herself. She has to do the motion again to get the information to use it in that case. So SB 1421 changed the way 4 categories of information were categorized and made them all subject to the Standard Public Records Act in California, which is, I think, the term most people are familiar with is FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act on the federal level. PRA, or Public Records Act, is the California equivalent. So these 4 categories of information that were now subject to a PRA request were information around police shootings, when an officer discharged a firearm at a person, information around use of force that resulted in great bodily injury or death, and information around a sustained finding of dishonesty and a sustained finding of sexual assault. So those 4 types of records are now public.
And how easy are they to get?
It depends on the ease. The process of requesting is fairly easy. The timeline of obtaining and getting and digesting is not necessarily. And different jurisdictions are different. San Francisco has been providing records kind of on a slow trickle. Other jurisdictions in the state have fought harder to not release records. So we made a request for our office on January 2nd of 2019, requesting all 4 categories for all current officers. We made that request to SFPD and DPA. We also requested information on the sheriff's department and other local and state agencies, including the California Department of Justice. The district attorney might have records on officers. So we made those records. to try and get everything that was newly available. And we're still getting responses from those requests nearly 3 years ago.
And what percentage of the information that you have, what percentage do you have of the information that you think should be available?
It's probably around 15%. I say probably because we don't know. We don't know how many records there are total, or how many records there are that are disclosable. So we don't know the universe that either DPA or SFPD, who's our primary source of this information, how much they have. I say 15% estimate because that's how many officers we've heard back on. So DPA and SFPD have both let us know on somewhere between 200 and 300 officers who have nothing to disclose. They've been able to tell us that much. And then we've also received some releases from both SFPD and DPA. DPA, as of last month, in their own reporting, really has released 46 incidents so far, and SFPD has released 108 incidents. And an incident might involve more than one officer. So going off the officer tally, which is we request information on 2,200 officers, we've heard back on about 250 to 300 officers.
And the slowness is due to what? Is it just reluctance? Is it?
I don't know that it's reluctance. I think there is a certain degree of lack of prioritization involved. But these files were made and never expected to be looked at again. They were put on a box in a shelf in a basement somewhere, probably. These are not, there was no system in place to go find these things. And when SB16 was passed, it was one of it created an immediate backlog because it went back forever. It's however far back the records exist. And SFPD and DPA both have records through at least the mid-90s of what I've seen. So we're talking about a solid 30 years of records. And then they have to go through and review them. And there's a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, there's some subjectivity in what records are releasable. So for example, on a police officer involved shooting, if an officer discharges a firearm at a person, all the records around that, all the investigative records, interview transcripts, interview recordings, photos of the scene, all that is releasable. And that's a pretty obvious set of records. A set of records that isn't as obvious is an officer uses force that results in great bodily injury. Because the officers, the way SFPD categorizes records and DPA also, they don't necessarily check if it's great bodily injury, which is a legal term of art that comes up in criminal cases. So they have to go through and examine uses of force to see if there was great bodily injury. So they're looking at photos, they're looking at medical records to determine whether there is. And then once they determine that a record does qualify for release, they then go through and redact it. And so they go through and redact personal information of the complainant or any other witnesses, because police reports have phone numbers, email addresses, even names, which they aren't you don't want necessarily out in the public.
Right. So you have this information on, more than 200 officers. What have you been able to do with it?
So it's not that much information, unfortunately. So we hoped to be able to see trends or patterns, that kind of thing. And we do some analysis. We do some summary, kind of internal. We make it available to all of our attorneys. Again, for example, a use of force resulting in great bodily injury could be useful for a case where the only charge is resisting arrest, right? But if an officer has 3 or 4 uses of force resulting in great bodily injury in the last year or two, that could be used to undermine the credibility that the officer initiated the force, right? So that's the hope of how these can be useful. And this is readily available public documents. We have an obligation to seek these out as criminal defense attorneys. So that's the hope, that it will be useful for attorneys, and it's available for attorneys so they can kind of do their due diligence in checking through things. But we just don't have that much to be able to detect any kind of patterns or do any kind of higher level work yet.
And useful to other groups as well, to nonprofits, to employers, to other police departments.
Yeah, I think it's definitely should be available, should be interesting to and of use to nonprofits, police reform advocates,
Mhm.
and really just any, and also the private defense bar. They don't have the resources, they don't have support staff to go through and request these records and figure out what they are, because sometimes you'll just get a record and says, here's a record. You have to read it to figure out who it's about and what it's about. And I think just in general, seeing how police investigations proceed, seeing how these things go on a typical basis, informs certainly voters and everyday citizens about how these kinds of things work. And I think as we see body camera footage, like from Minneapolis, for example, last week, right? Everyone's kind of aghast at what was going on. That's the kind of thing that wouldn't happen without transparency laws like this. And without, but wearing body worn cameras is great, but if it's not available for people to actually see, you're no better off having it exist.
Right. And do you feel that journalists have also used the information well and dug in on the information, or?
Yeah, definitely. I'll name drop Mission Local for you. There's been some good stories that come out of Mission Local, and seeing, kind of putting pieces together. There was a story, I think it was last year, about an officer who quit right before a decision came down, and then was started a couple days later in Antioch. And so that kind of context of timing and how the investigations go behind the scenes was never really available. There also was a really great KQED podcast called On Our Watch that just ended a couple of weeks ago. I think 6 or 7 episodes. That was about a lot of these records that they made similar requests that we did, and but they did all over the state, so they have kind of a larger pool to pull from. So there's definitely been some good reporting coming out of this also.
Right. What are some of the things that we can't get that you would like to see opened up?
Well, so what we can't get is everything else that exists. There's definitely a privacy interest that everyone has, but with the Police Officer Bill of Rights and various laws that came out around in the 70s that gave rise to the Pitchess scheme of obtaining documents in criminal defense cases, police officers' personnel files are incredibly hard to access. They're incredibly private. So there was recently SB16, which we touched on earlier, was just signed, I think last week or 2 weeks ago. That does open up a couple of more categories of information that's going to be disclosed as of January 1st. So this is sustained findings. And again, we go back to the sustained findings part of complaints of unreasonable or excessive force, and sustained findings that officers failed to intervene when another officer was using force that was clearly excessive. And then sustained findings
just officers who happened to be in the area but did not do anything, like the people who stood by in Garner's case. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it would have to be a sustained allegation of that, though. So an officer just being there wouldn't be enough. There has to be an investigation, and then the governing body, whether it's DPA in our case or SFPD, has to decide that yes, this was a violation of policy. And then the other two are sustained finding of prejudice or discrimination. And then also sustained finding that an officer made an unlawful arrest or unlawful search. So those are all pretty positive changes. The sustained finding verbiage is a little limiting on the files coming out, just because an officer, for example, dishonesty, which is in 1421, an officer might be accused of something that sounds like dishonesty, but what is actually sustained is failure to follow process or failure to comply with an order or something like that, which isn't dishonesty, so it wouldn't be
exactly. And I mean, what we found in our reporting is that very few findings are sustained.
Yes.
I mean, that's a really limited universe.
Yeah, I think there's been one dishonesty case that SFPD and DP have released.
Yeah. How would someone make, file for a record? What is sort of the process? Maybe you could walk us through that.
Yeah, so I'm most of my experience in San Francisco, I've requested records from other jurisdictions about officers who've transferred incidents to San Francisco, but primarily San Francisco. And since this is San Francisco League of Women Voters, SFPD, SF Sheriff, and DPA all have really simple and straightforward kind of web portals to request these records. On the SF Sheriff, it's a banner on the very top. It's request a record. And SFPD on their website, it's in one of the resources, Public Records Act request. And you can just fill in the information either on an incident. So if you know of something that happened, you can ask for records related to that incident. If you're curious about an officer, or potentially even you can just do like what we did, kind of like an omnibus request, what can I get? I will say all the records that we get, we do host publicly on our website,
Right.
Cop Monitor on the SF Public Defender website.
Yeah, everyone should be aware of that, Cop Monitor.
Yeah, so, but again, because we're only putting what we have, if you have a particular incident you want to look up, you can still do your own request and look it up. Just because SFPD hasn't gotten to it yet for us doesn't mean that they won't get to it for someone.
Let's see, can you do this anonymously is one of the questions?
Yes, yeah, so the web portal, you can do anonymous. You can request, and you would need an email address so they can contact you.
Right.
But that's easy enough to do.
And what generally is the response time?
So 3 years so far for some things.
When did you begin to get the first
so you make a request. The Public Records Act requires that they get in touch with you in 10 days and tell you whether they're the right people to have those records or not, and whether they'll and then whether they'll like what their next step is. And without fail, I mean, these records, like I said, they're hard to find. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of requests. They're going to invoke a 14-day extension as they look and sort through is one of the reasons that an extension can be granted. And then I get a message every 14 days that there's an extension coming. So
they can continue to extend as long as they want.
Seemingly, yes. There's been some cases. There was a court case in Oakland that we're following that the city of Oakland hadn't released anything, and a judge ordered them to release everything in 90 days. And that was maybe a month or two ago. So we'll see how that goes. There's been some litigation in San Jose around the release over there. I think KQED was involved in trying to force them to produce records. So I don't know that they can do it forever, but I mean, it's potentially indefinite.
But you're sort of also indicating that you're setting up sort of a legal precedent so that sort of option may end for the. Yeah,
it's kind of untested right now. I don't know what the legal precedent is going to come down. And the one in Oakland, and each set of facts is a little bit different. The one in Oakland was private parties requesting very specific records, so kind of everything. So there's no clear guideline on when.
But let me ask you, I mean, you clearly have waited a long time for this small number of records that you've received. Have you considered a lawsuit?
We've talked about our options. There's no enforcement mechanism in 1421, or it's kind of so if someone were to make their own request, you can do a sunshine ordinance complaint with the Board of Supervisors. And then you could also potentially sue. It's unclear if that would result in anything or not, but it's definitely an option that exists for public records.
Right, but I mean, in Oakland, they managed to get a judge say that the police department has to produce the records in 90 days, all of them.
Yeah, not all. Well, so all the ones that were being requested. It was a subset
Right.
about one particular incident.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
I don't know if a judge would say release everything, because there's no idea what the scope is of how many there are.
Mhm. And costs associated with making such a request?
So cities or counties can charge for the copying fees.
Mhm.
We're getting everything PDFs, so there are no copying fees. They can't include time and time of sorting through boxes as part of the fees. It's just like the actual expenses, paper and toner. But even I haven't had any fees from San Francisco so far.
Right. Can you give us a few examples of how you have used the information that you have, like what it's prevented, if anything, or what's it elucidated?
Yeah, I don't know if it's prevented anything. It's definitely it's shined a light on a couple of kind of a high profile cases about what happened kind of after the original reporting. We've also gotten records that then kind of kick our mind into gear about thinking other things we should be asking for or getting, or policy changes that might be a good idea.
An example of a policy change that may have come from this material?
Some of the SB16 changes are definitely came out of that. We have a state policy director who we would talk to and say, these are the issues we've had. And then I don't know how influential we were on Senator Skinner, but definitely like we started noticing things pretty quick that like the sustained finding of dishonesty, for example, is going to be an issue. And one of the changes that SB16 made is it changed the language from a sustained finding of dishonesty to a sustained finding involving dishonesty. So that could potentially change, because if an officer, if the officer takes money from a suspect, for example, that isn't necessarily dishonesty, but it involves dishonesty potentially. So if we can, in January, we're going to try and some of these kind of border cases that we've identified, try and see if we can see if there's any change.
And in terms of learning from this experience and going for the next round of legislation, where are you headed?
I think so. I think SB16 is a good kind of inching us closer. I think a big thing and a problem that SB16 still has is that it's the law enforcement agency or oversight agency is making these sustained findings, and that's the only way that it can be categorized as public record or as being sustained. So this is for dishonesty, for sexual assault, and then coming soon for unreasonable excessive force, failure to intervene, and prejudice. But if it could be a judicial officer, if it could be a judge saying this officer lacks credibility and is being dishonest, that I think if it qualified as a sustained finding, would open up kind of a new area and could expand the records that are available. I mean, that statement is public, and there's Mission Locals reported on this. There's a case where a federal judge said that about an SFPD officer, but those records, he might not have been found in violation of dishonesty, right, for purposes of 1421 release. So any records around the investigation about that and how it happened or why it happened haven't been released. So I think changing who can sustain a finding would be a really positive change in the future.
I mean, that would seem to happen jurisdiction to jurisdiction, or I mean, it seems like there would be a lot of
that'd have to be a state
pushback.
change, probably.
State change, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, and there's pushback too. There was in early versions of SB16, because we were following it from pretty early on. There was a more intensive timeline imposed on agencies. It was a fine of $1,000 a day for failure to respond within 45 days. And in SFPD and DPA, they both just kind of built that into their budget as a possibility of we're going to have to pay $300,000 a year in fines, but it ended up not being in the final bill. So some sort of an other enforcement mechanism, whether it's a carrot or a stick, I think could be good to get records released faster.
Right. And why is there any resistance or any slowness on the part of DPA, which is the agency that works for civilians and was given an additional budget from the voters in San Francisco and is sort of our watchdog institution? Why? That's curious to me.
I think the thing they would cite is staffing and resources. In one of the budget reports from the past year, DPA said the fastest they can get it done would be 9 years to clear the backlog. And then they had a and then if they reduce staffing, it would take 25 years. So and that's not to account for all the records that are being created between now and then, right? If we're dealing with a 30-year backlog and it takes 9 years, a 9-year backlog is going to take another 3 years, and then that 3-year backlog it kind of just keeps going and going. So that's and then I think SFPD also would say that it's staffing and resources, and it's just the commission had Senator Skinner on a couple weeks ago, the start of September, and Chief Scott mentioned, this is, we just got slammed and there's a huge budget need. But our position has always been that it also hasn't really been prioritized. You can put all hands on deck for 2 months maybe and see how much you get done.
Right. Is there any political push on the political side from Mayor Breed or from other mayors around the state to provide the budget? I mean,
not that I've seen, no. The police commission asked Senator Skinner if there'd be money allocated for this, and she said no one's asked us for it. So and this is just last month. So like next year, if someone asks for it, maybe we can make money for it. But no one. It's one of those things that kind of didn't find its way back up to the policymakers in Sacramento.
Right. I just wanted to check the chat. Are there any questions that I should be taking here? It's a good question, it's a good question. Do you feel like there's strong community support for police transparency and accountability in San Francisco, and why or why not?
I think so. I think just the attendance and participation in police commission meetings really shows there's a lot of people from the community who are paying attention. I think especially in the last 5 or 6 years, and then last year since George Floyd's death, there's been a huge focus on this. And in every assessment, every think tank, every police advocacy group, one of the first things they talk about is transparency and accountability. And and like I mentioned with the body worn camera footage, is having these records be available isn't really enough. People have to actually look at them, right, and then digest them and then take the next steps. And
yeah, it's interesting though. We attended a lot of the police reform working group meetings, and I attended. I mean, enormously. Just tedious on the one hand and fascinating on the other hand. And it always surprised me that there weren't more people there just from the community. I mean, there were the assigned people from the community who were there and the representatives of the community. But I thought, wow, this is where policy happens. I mean, it's slow. It takes a long time, but it's enormously important.
Yeah, it's usually not terribly interesting in the moment. But there's nuggets of change that happen in there. I think just being involved, being present, is a large part of it.
Yeah. Let me just take this. Any ways in which the public can become more informed, of course, attending meetings, but the police commission meetings, why don't you talk about those and how important those are or aren't?
Attending police commission meetings, if only to see kind of the inaction that the police commission is taking, right? There's a lot of topics that the police commission are not moving on. And you might hear one commissioner talk about something, but then it never comes up again. Whether it's just to timing or priorities or whatever. My experience has been that the police commission responds to prompts, right? We started going to the police commission on a regular basis in May of 2019 because it had been 5 months since we made our requests for records under 1421, and we had received nothing. And so within a few weeks, we started getting records, and then we kept going, we kept complaining, and they finally adopted a policy on the prioritization of releasing records and the process of releasing records. And so just kind of by, being the squeaky wheel.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's very important, and they're almost every Wednesday night, and you can get the
Yeah.
agendas online and go before.
And it's so much easier now, honestly. We used to go to City Hall and we'd stay there till 9 o'clock at night. Now I do it from my kitchen. It's great. It's all on. It's
I
all
think
remote.
I'm supposed to wrap this up about now, but that was excellent, and really, thank you so much, and thanks to
Yeah, thank
the
you.
League of Women Voters as well. This is a great informative session, I hope. Take care.